The courtroom was suffocatingly quiet, save for the rhythmic ticking of the clock mounted high above the judge's bench. The tension in the air felt thick, pressing down on the lone figure standing in the defendant's spot. Jamal Carter, a 17-year-old black teen, shackled at the wrist like a hardened criminal. His eyes scanned the room, darting between the unfamiliar faces of the jury, the murmuring audience behind him, and the cold, unfeeling stare of the white judge perched above him on the bench, Judge Harold Reynolds. Reynolds was an older man, his silver hair slicked back neatly, his piercing blue eyes filled with amusement rather than concern. To him, this was just another case, just another black boy who had supposedly found himself on the wrong side of the law. He rested his chin on his hand, regarding Jamal with a smirk. "Jamal Carter," the judge finally spoke, his voice dripping with condescension. "Charged with armed robbery. Caught on camera. Store owner identified him. Sounds like an open and shut case, wouldn't you say?" A low chuckle rippled through the courtroom. Jamal didn't flinch. Beside him, his public defender, a tired, uninterested man in his 40s, barely lifted his head. He had barely even spoken to Jamal before the trial began. It was clear he had no intention of putting up a fight. "Your Honor," the defense attorney droned lazily, flipping through his paperwork, "given the overwhelming evidence against my client, we believe it would be in his best interest to accept the plea deal." Jamal's heart slammed against his chest. A plea deal? His blood ran cold. He hadn't done anything wrong. How could he accept guilt for a crime he didn't commit? The murmuring in the courtroom grew louder, the audience already casting their judgment on the young black teen in cuffs. The white prosecutor leaned forward, smirking slightly as if he knew how this would play out. Judge Reynolds leaned back in his chair. "Smart choice, kid," he mused, as if Jamal had already agreed. "Plead guilty, and we'll show you some mercy. Otherwise, Mara," his smirk widened, "we go to trial, and trust me, juries aren't too kind to young men like you." The words hit like a slap. Young men like you. Jamal had heard that phrase his entire life. On the streets, in school, even in the store he was falsely accused of robbing. For the first time since stepping into the courtroom, Jamal finally spoke. "No." It was just one word. The room went silent. Even the judge seemed momentarily caught off guard. "Excuse me." Reynolds lifted a brow. Jamal's pulse was racing, but his voice was steady, strong. "I said no. I'm not taking any plea deal. I'm innocent." The judge's amusement returned tenfold. He chuckled, shaking his head. "You're innocent? Son, there's video footage of you robbing that store." Jamal's jaw tightened. There was video footage, but it wasn't him. The real culprit was someone else, someone whose identity had conveniently been ignored. The judge leaned forward, resting his elbows on the bench. "And tell me, Mr. Carter, since you seem to have all the answers, if you're not taking the plea, what exactly do you plan to do?" Jamal took a deep breath, his hands clenched into fists against the cold steel of the handcuffs. "I want to represent myself." The laughter was instant. A burst of cruel amusement erupted from the audience, from the jury, even from his own defense attorney. The public defender rubbed his temples, looking at Jamal as if he had just signed his own death sentence. Judge Reynolds actually laughed. "You? Represent yourself?" He shook his head, leaning back. "Boy, you think you're some kind of lawyer?" Another wave of laughter. Jamal didn't flinch. He raised his head, his dark brown eyes locking onto the judge's with an intensity that made the laughter die down just a little. "I know my rights," he said calmly, "and I know when I'm being railroaded." Judge Reynolds smirked again. "Railroaded? Now there's a word you don't hear from street kids." Jamal's jaw tightened. "I'm not a street kid. I've spent more time in the library than I ever did in the streets." Silence. The confidence in his voice made a few people shift in their seats. Judge Reynolds studied him, something unreadable flashing across his expression. This wasn't the response he was expecting. "All right, kid," the judge finally said, a mocking edge to his voice. "Since you're so eager to humiliate yourself, I'll allow it." He turned to the prosecutor. "Mr. Davis, I hope you're ready for the easiest trial of your career. The prosecutor chuckled. Oh, this is gonna be fun, Your Honor. Jamal's hands clenched even tighter in the cuffs, but inside he felt something different. Determination. They thought this was a joke. They thought he was walking into his own destruction. They had no idea what he was capable of. Jamal Carter had always been different. Growing up in one of the roughest neighborhoods in Atlanta, kids like him were expected to follow a path already written for them, one that led to either a prison cell or an early grave. But Jamal refused to be another statistic. While other kids were out playing ball or getting into trouble, he spent his time in the public library. It had started when he was just 12 years old, the first time he had seen his mother crying over an eviction notice. He had asked her why they had to leave their apartment, and her answer had been simple yet soul-crushing. Because we can't afford a lawyer to fight it, baby. That night, Jamal had snuck out and walked 3 miles to the nearest library. He spent hours studying eviction laws, tenants' rights, and how court cases worked. He was just a kid, but he understood one thing: knowledge was power. By the time he was 14, he had read more legal textbooks than most adults ever would. Case law, legal loopholes, court procedures. He memorized them like other kids memorize rap lyrics. But none of that mattered now. Now Jamal was the one standing in a courtroom, falsely accused of a crime he didn't commit. The robbery had happened 2 months ago. A small convenience store on the outskirts of town. A masked figure had burst in, waving a gun, demanding cash. The security footage was grainy, but the build of the suspect? Tall, lean, black. And just like that, the cops had grabbed the first black teen they could find, Jamal. But what the police didn't mention, what they chose to ignore, was that the real criminal was Ethan Reynolds, the judge's son. Ethan, a wealthy white teenager, had been arrested twice before for vandalism, for reckless driving. But his father always made the charges disappear. And this time, he had robbed a store for fun, just to see if he could get away with it. When the police had questioned him, his father had stepped in immediately. And suddenly, the entire focus of the case shifted. Jamal became the scapegoat. He didn't have money, he didn't have a father in power. All he had was a single mother working double shifts as a nurse, struggling just to keep the lights on. And now, here he was, shackled, humiliated, staring down a racist judge who had already decided his fate. Judge Reynolds wanted to make an example out of him. Mr. Carter, do you understand the consequences of what you're asking? The judge drawled, a smirk tugging at his lips. You're choosing to represent yourself in a criminal trial. Against the state, against a trained prosecutor. The courtroom laughed again. Jamal stayed silent, his jaw clenched. You could go away for 10 years, Reynolds continued, tapping his gavel lightly against the bench. A whole decade of your life gone. No college, no future. You really want to gamble with that? Jamal lifted his chin, unshaken. I want to prove my innocence, he said firmly, and I won't let a court-appointed lawyer throw me under the bus. His public defender barely reacted. The man was already packing up his files, relieved to wash his hands of the case. Judge Reynolds sighed dramatically, shaking his head. You know, he said, leaning forward, I've seen boys like you before. Smart enough to think they know everything, but not smart enough to realize how the world really works. The words cut deep, but Jamal refused to show it. And how does the world work, Your Honor? Jamal asked, his voice steady. The judge's blue eyes gleamed. Boys like you lose. The silence that followed felt deafening. Jamal could feel the weight of it pressing down on him, but he wouldn't break. He couldn't afford to. His mother sat in the front row, clutching the hem of her shirt, her knuckles white. Her eyes, so full of pain, of fear, were locked onto him. He couldn't let her down. Very well, Judge Reynolds finally said, smirking. You want to play lawyer? Fine. Let's see how well you do. Jamal was officially defending himself. And from the way the entire courtroom sneered at him, They already thought he had lost, but they had no idea who they were dealing with. Jamal took a deep breath, steadying himself as he faced the courtroom. His hands clenched behind his back, his wrists still red from the cold metal of the cuffs. "Your Honor," he began, his voice clear and firm, "I'd like to present evidence that—" Bang! Judge Reynolds slammed his gavel down, his smirk widening. Enough." Jamal froze. "You're not a lawyer, boy," the judge said, leaning forward. "Know your place." The words echoed through the courtroom like a gunshot. A few low chuckles rippled through the audience. Detectives, court officers, even the clerk. They all knew how this worked. Jamal felt his jaw tighten. No matter what he said, no matter what he did, they had already made up their minds. But he wasn't done. "Your Honor, if I could just—" "You can't," Reynolds snapped, cutting him off again. "This is a trial, not a game. And you, young man, are playing with fire." Jamal swallowed the bitterness in his throat. He had expected this. He knew Reynolds wasn't going to just let him talk. But what happened next? That he didn't see coming. His court-appointed public defender, a balding man named Eric Dunlap, who smelled like cigarettes and indifference, stood up with a heavy sigh. "Your Honor, may I approach?" Reynolds waved him forward, and Dunlap turned to Jamal, lowering his voice. "Kid, listen," he muttered, his breath hot against Jamal's ear. "Take the deal." Jamal blinked. "What?" "The deal." Dunlap gave him a pointed look. "The DA's offering 5 years. Take it." Jamal felt his stomach drop. 5 years. "I didn't do anything," he whispered harshly. Dunlap shrugged, unbothered. "Doesn't matter. This judge, this system, they don't care, kid. Take the plea, get out in 3 with good behavior." Jamal's hands curled into fists. "I said no." Dunlap sighed, rubbing his forehead. "Look, Carter, I get it. You want to be a big shot? Fight the system, whatever. But you're not gonna win." Jamal stared at him. His own lawyer had given up before the fight had even started. "You were never gonna defend me, were you?" Jamal whispered. Dunlap didn't even bother denying it. "Take the deal." Jamal's chest burned with anger. He looked at his mother. Her eyes were already glassy with tears. 5 years meant she'd spend 5 years alone, fighting to survive. 5 years meant he'd be locked in a cell for something he didn't do. No, he wouldn't accept it. Jamal turned back to Reynolds. "I said I want to present my evidence." The judge's smirk didn't fade. "Oh, you mean this?" Jamal's blood ran cold. Reynolds gestured to the court clerk, who handed him a manila folder. The one piece of evidence Jamal had, a blurry but enhanced screenshot of the security footage. And now the judge was holding it. "Funny thing," Reynolds mused, flipping it open. "Seems like there was a mix-up in the evidence room." A hush fell over the courtroom. Jamal's breath hitched. No, this wasn't happening. "What do you mean?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. Reynolds chuckled. "I mean, your evidence is gone." He lifted the now empty folder, mockingly. Poof, just like that. Jamal's world tilted. They had tampered with it. His one shot, his only proof, gone. His mother let out a small, broken gasp. And suddenly, Jamal understood. This trial wasn't about guilt or innocence. It never was. It was about making an example out of him. Judge Reynolds wasn't here to uphold justice. He was here to destroy him. And with the evidence missing? He would. Jamal's hands trembled. Not with fear, with rage. This courtroom was his battlefield, and they had just tipped the scales against him. Fine. If the judge wouldn't let him speak, he'd force him to. Jamal locked eyes with Reynolds, his stare unwavering. "If you won't let me defend myself," he said slowly, his voice steady, controlled, "then I'll make sure you have no choice." The judge's smirk faltered. Just for a second. Audience suspense. What was Jamal planning? How could he fight back when the entire system was against him? Jamal's pulse pounded in his ears, but his face remained unreadable. He had to stay calm. The judge thought he had won. They all did. But they didn't know Jamal Carter. He took a breath and spoke, his voice cutting through the courtroom's murmurs. Your Honor, under the Sixth Amendment, I have the right to represent myself. A ripple of shock ran through the room. Even the prosecutor raised an eyebrow. The court clerk shifted uncomfortably. The public defender, his so-called lawyer, stared at him like he'd lost his mind. Till Judge Reynolds leaned back in his chair, his lips curling into a mocking smirk. You want to represent yourself? He asked, chuckling. A kid like you? Jamal didn't blink. That's my right, isn't it? The judge let out a low laugh. He looked around the courtroom, as if waiting for someone else to join in on the joke. A few officers exchanged smirks, but no one spoke. Jamal had just thrown a wrench into their easy conviction. Reynolds tapped his gavel lightly. All right, let's humor the boy. He leaned forward. You do realize what this means, don't you? No lawyer, no help, no second chances. You'll be facing trained prosecutors all alone. Jamal's jaw tightened. I understand. The judge's eyes gleamed with amusement. Fine, then let's see just how smart you are. He banged the gavel sharply. Trial begins tomorrow. Jamal sat at the kitchen table, a pile of books in front of him. Pages worn, corners folded, some covered in old library stamps. This was his arsenal. His mother, Mrs. Carter, stood in the doorway, her arms crossed. Her eyes were red, a mixture of exhaustion and fear. Jamal, baby, are you sure about this? He didn't look up. I don't have a choice, Ma. She let out a shaky breath. That judge ain't gonna let you win. Jamal swallowed hard. He knew that. Then I'll make it impossible for him to ignore me. Mrs. Carter walked over, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. I know you're smart, Jamal, but these people, they ain't playing fair. They've already decided what they want to do to you. Jamal finally looked up. That's exactly why I have to fight. She studied him for a long moment. Then with a soft sigh, she sat down beside him. All right, show me what you got. For the first time that night, Jamal smiled. Jamal flipped through pages, soaking in every word, every loophole, every technicality. He read case laws, landmark rulings, anything that could give him an edge. The prosecution needs proof beyond a reasonable doubt, he murmured, but if I can poke holes in their case. His mother listened intently, occasionally nodding, but her fear never faded. What about the missing evidence? She asked. Jamal's eyes darkened. I have a feeling the judge didn't actually lose it. He just doesn't want it presented. His mother clenched her jaw. So what do we do? Jamal tapped the book. Force the prosecution to admit there were inconsistencies with the evidence. Even if they don't return it, that admission alone could help me. Mrs. Carter shook her head in disbelief. Lord help me. My son is out here building a defense like a real lawyer. Jamal smirked. They wanted to treat me like a criminal? He shut the book. Fine, but tomorrow I make sure they remember my name. Audience hook. Is this a genius move or a disaster waiting to happen? The courtroom was packed. Reporters, onlookers, even other attorneys, all drawn in by the spectacle of a 17-year-old defending himself. Jamal sat at the defendant's table, his shoulders squared, his jaw set. He wasn't just here to survive, he was here to win. Judge Reynolds tapped his gavel. Let's begin. The prosecution may proceed. Jamal rose to his feet, his presence commanding. Ladies and gentlemen of the court, I stand before you today not just as a defendant, but as a young black man fighting for the truth. A murmur ran through the crowd. The judge's eyebrows twitched. The prosecution claims I committed this robbery, but let's examine the facts. The key evidence, mysteriously misplaced. The witness statements, inconsistent. And the real criminal? Jamal turned, locking eyes with the prosecutor. Conveniently missing from this courtroom? The jury leaned in. Even the bailiff looked intrigued. But what if I told you that this case isn't about justice? It's about power, about a system that would rather throw a poor black kid in prison than hold a wealthy man's son accountable. Gasps, whispers. Judge Reynolds slammed the gavel down. Enough! Stick to the facts, Carter! Jamal didn't blink. I am, Your Honor, and the facts don't lie. The tension was electric. The jury was listening. For the first time, Jamal was winning. The prosecutor stood, a smirk playing on his lips. That was quite the performance, Mr. Carter, but I'd like to introduce a new witness. Jamal's stomach dropped. The doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. A man walked in. Tall, mid-30s, a face Jamal had never seen before. This is Daniel Reese, an upstanding citizen who saw Jamal Carter leaving the crime scene. Jamal's hands curled into fists. What? The prosecutor turned to the witness. Mr. Reese, please tell the court what you saw. Daniel Reese cleared his throat. Wearing dark clothes, looked real nervous. I remember it clearly. Jamal's mind raced. This was a lie, a complete fabrication. But the jury was watching. The judge was grinning. The prosecutor had set a trap. Jamal took a deep breath. Stay calm. Mr. Reese, he said, stepping forward. You say you saw me that night? Reese nodded. Clear as day. Jamal tilted his head. That's strange, because I was at home with my mother that night. In fact, we were watching TV. The prosecutor leaned in. Your mother isn't a credible alibi, Carter. She's your family. Of course she'd lie for you. A cruel laugh rippled through the judge's throat. This witness, however, is impartial, and I find his testimony quite convincing. Jamal's fingernails dug into his palm. They had played their final card, a planted witness, a rigged system. His case was falling apart. For the first time since the trial started, Jamal smirked. Not out of nervousness, not out of defeat, but because he had just found their weakness. The prosecutor faltered. The smirk unsettled him. Judge Reynolds' eyes narrowed. Something funny, Carter? Jamal met his gaze. Yeah, actually. Real funny. The audience held their breath. What was he planning? The courtroom buzzed with tension. Every eye was on Jamal. The smirk on his face wasn't arrogance. It was confidence. Judge Reynolds leaned forward. Carter, if you have something to say, say it. Otherwise, I'll have you removed. Jamal exhaled slowly. Then he turned to the false witness. Mr. Reese, you said you saw me leaving the crime scene that night? The witness nodded. Clear as day. Jamal tapped his fingers on the defense table. And you're absolutely sure it was me? Reese's jaw tightened. Yes, 100%. Jamal paused. Let the silence stretch. Then he grinned. Interesting, because the store was robbed at 9:45 p.m. The courtroom stayed dead quiet. Jamal picked up a legal document from his table. This is the security log from the library I visit every night. He turned to the jury, holding up the paper. It confirms I checked in at 9:30 p.m. and didn't leave until closing time. Gasps. Whispers erupted. Jamal turned back to Reese. Tell me, Mr. Reese, how exactly did I run out of a store I was never inside? Reese's face twitched. I must have mixed up the time. Jamal didn't let up. You mean to tell this courtroom that you came here to testify under oath, and you're not even sure what time it happened? The jury took notes. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably. Jamal walked toward Reese. Slow, deliberate. Who sent you, Mr. Reese? I don't know what you're talking about. Who sent you? Silence. The pressure was crushing. Then Reese snapped. They made me do it, he blurted. The DA. They told me to testify. I didn't even see anything. The entire courtroom erupted. Judge Reynolds' face drained of color. Jamal wasn't done. Your Honor, before you rush to declare this a simple mistake, let's talk about a real crime. Jamal slid another document onto the prosecution's table. I did my research. Judge Reynolds has a long history of sentencing black defendants to the maximum penalty, even when evidence was weak. Murmurs filled the room. A reporter started taking notes. But it gets worse, Jamal continued, his voice steady, sharp. A recent investigation found that in 87% of his cases, Judge Reynolds ruled in favor of the prosecution, particularly when the defendant was a minority. The judge slammed the gavel down. That's enough. Is it, though? Jamal turned to the jury. Or is that exactly what a guilty man would say? The courtroom was in chaos. For the first time, Judge Reynolds looked afraid. The real criminal's father tries to intervene and fails. Suddenly, from the prosecution side, a well-dressed man stood up. That's enough of this circus. Jamal tilted his head. It was Charles Whitmore, the wealthy father of the real criminal, the man pulling all the strings. This is ridiculous, Whitmore barked. You're attacking an upstanding judge, and for what? Some thug trying to weasel his way out of prison? The jury visibly recoiled. Jamal folded his arms. Tell me something, Mr. Whitmore. Why are you so nervous? Whitmore's nostrils flared. I'm not. Because let's be real. Jamal stepped closer. This was never about justice. It was about protecting your son. The courtroom fell deathly silent. Jamal turned to the prosecutor. If this trial was about me, why isn't the real suspect sitting here instead? The prosecutor froze. Jamal pressed on. And if this case was about the truth, why did you present a fake witness? Whitmore's face twisted in rage. I won't let some street kid ruin my family. Too late, Jamal cut him off. Click. A reporter had just taken his picture. Whitmore's eyes widened. He knew what was coming. The room was spinning out of the judge's control. Jamal turned back to him. Your Honor, it's over. The prosecution's case has collapsed. Their witness lied. The entire thing was built on corruption. Judge Reynolds was breathing hard. His career, his power, everything was crumbling. He had no choice. Case dismissed. The gavel hit the bench. The courtroom erupted. As reporters swarmed in, Jamal stood still for a moment. Then he turned to the judge. You once laughed at me for thinking I was a lawyer, he said. Reynolds looked up. But today I didn't just defend myself. I exposed you. The judge had no response. Jamal smiled. He had won. Jamal stood still for a moment, soaking it in. The courtroom buzzed with whispers, gasps, and shock. The gavel had fallen, the case dismissed, but the weight of what had just happened still hung thick in the air. Judge Reynolds looked shaken. His reputation was in tatters, his authority slipping through his fingers like sand. Jamal turned to him. You mocked me for thinking I was a lawyer, he said, voice steady, controlled. The whole courtroom listened. You silenced me. You tried to bury me under a system you thought I couldn't outsmart. Reynolds stared back, expression unreadable. Jamal took a step closer. Mock me all you want, but one day you'll be standing in front of me. He let the words hang in the air, then with a slight smirk he added, in my courtroom. Mic drop. The room erupted. The reporters, the spectators, everyone felt it. Even the judge, despite his stubborn, clenched jaw, knew what was coming. The camera flashes, the loud courtroom, the injustice. It all felt like a distant memory now. Jamal Carter adjusted his robe. The same courtroom, the same wooden bench. But this time, he wasn't the one standing on trial. He was the judge. His nameplate read, Judge Jamal Carter. The young black kid who once stood in this very courtroom, helpless and powerless, was now the one delivering justice. The room quieted as the next case was called. The defendant stepped forward. Out, an older, tired man shuffled in. His once powerful presence was gone. His hair had grayed, his back slightly hunched. Jamal leaned forward. For the first time in years, he looked into the eyes of Judge Reynolds. Except now, Reynolds was the one on trial. For a second, neither man spoke. The courtroom held its breath. Reynolds' eyes darted around like he wanted to escape, but there was nowhere to run. Not anymore. Jamal picked up a case file, flipping through it slowly. Deliberate, controlled. Then without looking up, he said, "The court will now hear the case of—" He paused just for a moment before lifting his gaze. "Defendant, former Judge William Reynolds." The entire room felt the weight of it. Reynolds's throat bobbed. For the first time in his life, he felt powerless. Jamal sat back in his chair, watching the man who once mocked him stand before him in shame. "Let's begin," he said. The courtroom was suffocatingly quiet, save for the rhythmic ticking of the clock mounted high above the judge's bench. The tension in the air felt thick, pressing down on the lone figure standing in the defendant's spot. Jamal Carter, a 17-year-old black teen, shackled at the wrist like a hardened criminal. His eyes scanned the room, darting between the unfamiliar faces of the jury, the murmuring audience behind him, and the cold, unfeeling stare of the white judge perched above him on the bench, Judge Harold Reynolds. Reynolds was an older man, his silver hair slicked back neatly, his piercing blue eyes filled with amusement rather than concern. To him, this was just another case, just another black boy who had supposedly found himself on the wrong side of the law. He rested his chin on his hand, regarding Jamal with a smirk. "Jamal Carter," the judge finally spoke, his voice dripping with condescension. "Charged with armed robbery. Caught on camera. Store owner identified him. Sounds like an open and shut case, wouldn't you say?" A low chuckle rippled through the courtroom. Jamal didn't flinch. Beside him, his public defender, a tired, uninterested man in his 40s, barely lifted his head. He had barely even spoken to Jamal before the trial began. It was clear he had no intention of putting up a fight. "Your Honor," the defense attorney droned lazily, flipping through his paperwork, "given the overwhelming evidence against my client, we believe it would be in his best interest to accept the plea deal." Jamal's heart slammed against his chest. A plea deal? His blood ran cold. He hadn't done anything wrong. How could he accept guilt for a crime he didn't commit? The murmuring in the courtroom grew louder, the audience already casting their judgment on the young black teen in cuffs. The white prosecutor leaned forward, smirking slightly as if he knew how this would play out. Judge Reynolds leaned back in his chair. "Smart choice, kid," he mused, as if Jamal had already agreed. "Plead guilty, and we'll show you some mercy. Otherwise, Mara," his smirk widened. "We go to trial, and trust me, juries aren't too kind to young men like you." The words hit like a slap. Young men like you. Jamal had heard that phrase his entire life. On the streets, in school, even in the store he was falsely accused of robbing. For the first time since stepping into the courtroom, Jamal finally spoke. "No." It was just one word. The room went silent. Even the judge seemed momentarily caught off guard. "Excuse me." Reynolds lifted a brow. Jamal's pulse was racing, but his voice was steady, strong. "I said no. I'm not taking any plea deal. I'm innocent." The judge's amusement returned tenfold. He chuckled, shaking his head. "You're innocent? Son, there's video footage of you robbing that store." Jamal's jaw tightened. There was video footage, but it wasn't him. The real culprit was someone else, someone whose identity had conveniently been ignored. The judge leaned forward, resting his elbows on the bench. "And tell me, Mr. Carter, since you seem to have all the answers, if you're not taking the plea, what exactly do you plan to do?" Jamal took a deep breath, his hands clenched into fists against the cold steel of the handcuffs. "I want to represent myself." The laughter was instant. A burst of cruel amusement erupted from the audience, from the jury, even from his own defense attorney. The public defender rubbed his temples, looking at Jamal as if he had just signed his own death sentence. Judge Reynolds actually laughed. "You? Represent yourself?" He shook his head, leaning back. "Boy, you think you're some kind of lawyer?" Another wave of laughter. Jamal didn't flinch. He raised his head, his dark brown eyes locking onto the judge's with an intensity that made the laughter die down just a little. "I know my rights," he said calmly, "and I know when I'm being railroaded." Judge Reynolds smirked again. "Railroaded? Now there's a word you don't hear from street kids." Jamal's jaw tightened. "I'm not a street kid. I've spent more time in the library than I ever did in the streets. Silence. The confidence in his voice made a few people shift in their seats. Judge Reynolds studied him, something unreadable flashing across his expression. This wasn't the response he was expecting. All right, kid, the judge finally said, a mocking edge to his voice. Since you're so eager to humiliate yourself, I'll allow it. He turned to the prosecutor. Mr. Davis, I hope you're ready for the easiest trial of your career. The prosecutor chuckled. Oh, this is gonna